The marble floors of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel stretch endlessly under fluorescent lights, polished to a mirror finish that reflects the quiet footsteps of men and women who never raise their voices. The air conditioning hums at exactly 72 degrees. Outside, the Swiss countryside sleeps under a blanket of snow. But inside these halls, the temperature never changes. The conversations happen in whispers. The decisions shape continents. And every morning at 9:15, representatives from central banks across 63 countries gather around tables where the wood grain costs more than most people earn in a decade. They discuss numbers. They review reports. They make recommendations that will ripple through every currency, every trade route, every savings account on Earth. What they rarely discuss is how they inherited a system that was never designed to work the way it works today. How mechanisms created centuries ago by men who never imagined global trade, digital transactions, or economies measured in trillions now determine who prospers and who struggles across 7 billion lives. The paradox that should keep you awake at night is this: the most powerful financial network in human history operates on infrastructure built when messages traveled by horseback. You live inside a financial system that touches every transaction you make, every paycheck you receive, every investment you hold. But the architecture governing these flows wasn't designed by economists or technologists or anyone who understood what the global economy would become. It was assembled piece by piece across 4 centuries by individuals responding to immediate crises, each solving problems they could see while creating problems they couldn't imagine. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, known as SWIFT, processes 44 million messages every day. It connects 11,500 institutions across more than 200 countries. When you send money internationally, when corporations settle trade deals, when governments transfer billions in foreign aid, the instructions flow through SWIFT servers in Belgium. The system has become so essential that excluding a country from SWIFT is considered an economic weapon more powerful than traditional sanctions. Yet SWIFT began in 1973 as a simple solution to a mundane problem: how to send payment instructions more efficiently than telex machines. The story of how this happened begins in the counting houses of medieval Europe, where Italian merchants discovered that moving gold and silver across continents was dangerous, expensive, and slow. What they created instead was something far more elegant and far more dangerous: the promise that wealth could exist as information. By the 14th century, a merchant in London could write a letter instructing a banker in Florence to pay gold to a trader in Venice. The gold never moved, the information moved, the debt moved, and slowly, imperceptibly, the foundation was laid for a system where numbers on ledgers became more important than the physical wealth they represented. What those medieval merchants didn't realize was that they had discovered something that would eventually allow small groups of institutions to control the flow of global commerce simply by controlling the messages that made transactions possible. The first turning point came in 1694 in a London coffee house where William Paterson sat across from men who controlled England's largest fortunes. Outside, the Thames flowed thick with the sewage of 1 million people. Inside, candlelight flickered across documents that would reshape civilization. King William needed money to fight France. The traditional approach was simple: borrow from wealthy merchants, pay them back with interest. But Paterson proposed something different. Instead of temporary loans, he suggested permanent debt. The government would pay interest forever, but never repay the principal. The wealthy would give their gold to a new institution called the Bank of England. The bank would lend to the government would pay interest from tax revenue, and the debt would become eternal, passed from generation to generation, like a hereditary obligation. Paterson believed this would create stability. What he created was an incentive structure that made debt profitable rather than problematic. The men around that table in 1694 thought they were solving a war funding crisis. They were actually designing a system where lending money to governments would become the most secure investment in human history. The second evolution happened during the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, when Nathan Rothschild discovered that information moved faster than armies and could be more profitable than trade. In 1815, couriers brought news of Wellington's victory at Waterloo to London, a full day before official dispatches arrived. Rothschild used those 24 hours to manipulate the bond market with surgical precision. First, he sold British government bonds aggressively, signaling to other traders that Britain had lost the battle. Panic selling drove prices down. Then quietly, he bought massive quantities at the collapsed prices. When official news of victory arrived the next day, bond prices soared. Rothschild made millions, but more importantly, he demonstrated that controlling information flow could be more valuable than controlling physical wealth. What Rothschild didn't realize was that he had proven that financial networks could be gamed by those with better information, faster communication, or deeper understanding of market psychology. He had shown that the system could be captured not through force or law, but through superior strategic positioning. By the early 1900s, the mechanisms Patterson and Rothschild had pioneered were spreading across every developed economy. Governments borrowed permanently rather than temporarily. International bond markets connected every major capital. Financial information flowed through increasingly sophisticated networks controlled by fewer and fewer institutions. But the system still operated at the speed of telegraph wires and steamships. The next evolution required a crisis that would make the old infrastructure obviously inadequate. That crisis came in 1907, when the American financial system seized up completely. Banks failed across the country, the stock market crashed, credit froze, and J.P. Morgan, then 70 years old, personally organized a rescue by gathering the most powerful bankers in New York in his private library and forcing them to pledge their own money to stabilize the system. It worked, but Morgan knew it couldn't work again. He was aging, the system was growing, and the next crisis might be too large for any individual to manage. What Morgan and his associates created in response was a central banking system disguised as a government institution. The Federal Reserve looked public, but its structure ensured that private banks maintained control over money creation, interest rates, and credit allocation. They had solved the crisis of 1907 by making crisis management permanent and largely invisible. The fourth architect emerged during the chaos of the 1980s debt crisis, when developing countries across Latin America defaulted on billions in loans to American banks. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil owed $60 billion, Argentina owed $40 billion. The interest rates on these loans had tripled, making payment impossible. This should have meant massive losses for the banks that had made these loans. Instead, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker orchestrated something unprecedented: bailouts disguised as restructuring. The International Monetary Fund would lend countries enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. In exchange, those countries would surrender economic sovereignty. They would cut government spending, privatize state assets, open markets to foreign investment, and accept permanent oversight of their economic policies. Volcker had discovered that when debt became too large to repay, it could be restructured to become permanent and profitable. Countries would never escape their obligations, but banks would never lose money. What Volcker didn't anticipate was that he had created a template for making debt crises profitable rather than destructive. He had shown that financial problems could be solved by adding more debt, as long as the payments kept flowing. These four innovations, created across 3 centuries by individuals responding to immediate pressures, combined to form something none of them had intended: a global system where debt could never be eliminated, where information flow determined financial outcomes, where central banks could create unlimited money to prevent any crisis that might threaten the structure, and where countries that couldn't pay their obligations could be restructured rather than released. The mechanisms were elegant, the incentives were clear, and the results were mathematically inevitable. What emerged was a system where the flows of global commerce increasingly depended on networks controlled by fewer institutions, where countries that challenged those networks could be isolated from international trade, and where the promise of wealth had become more important than wealth itself. But here's what none of the architects realized they were building. They had created a system where promises mattered more than gold, where information traveled faster than armies, and where debt had become immortal. But the infrastructure connecting it all still moved at the speed of telegraph cables and shipping schedules. Every international transaction required layers of correspondence between banks in different countries. Settlement could take weeks. Errors were common. And as global trade expanded exponentially after World War II, the old methods of moving money began to buckle under their own complexity. In the basement of Chase Manhattan Bank in 1973, computer programmers worked 16-hour shifts under fluorescent lights that never dimmed. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and fresh coffee. Upstairs, executives in wool suits discussed a problem that was becoming impossible to ignore. International payments were drowning in paperwork. A simple wire transfer from New York to London required dozens of messages sent through multiple intermediaries. Each message had to be manually typed, verified, and retransmitted. Human error introduced delays that could cost millions in foreign exchange fluctuations. The banks needed a solution, and they needed it fast. What they created was elegantly simple: a standardized messaging system that would allow any bank to communicate with any other bank using non-identical formats and procedures. They called it the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT was born not from grand vision, but from bureaucratic necessity. The programmers working in that basement believed they were solving a technical problem. They were creating something far more consequential: the nervous system of global finance. Within a decade, SWIFT connected thousands of banks across dozens of countries. Every international payment instruction flowed through its servers. Every major trade settlement passed through its networks. What had begun as a simple improvement to banking efficiency had become the foundation upon which all international commerce rested. The system worked so well that alternatives became unnecessary. The network effects were mathematical. The more banks that joined SWIFT, the more valuable it became to every other bank. Soon, participation wasn't optional. It was essential for survival. But here's what the architects of SWIFT never anticipated. They had built a system where exclusion meant economic death. A country cut off from SWIFT couldn't conduct international trade. Its banks couldn't settle foreign transactions. Its businesses couldn't receive payments from overseas customers. What had been designed as a neutral utility had become the most powerful economic weapon in human history. The ability to exclude nations from the global financial network gave unprecedented leverage to whoever controlled access, and that control rested not with any government, but with a consortium of banks operating under Belgian law, from servers housed in secure facilities across 3 continents. The first test of this power came in 2012, when European and American officials pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks as part of sanctions over the country's nuclear program. Iran's economy contracted by 20% within 2 years. Trade with traditional partners collapsed. The message was clear: challenge the international order, and you could be severed from the global economy entirely. SWIFT had become more than infrastructure. It had become a tool of geopolitical control. But tools of control create incentives for those being controlled to find alternatives. The system that began with medieval merchants writing letters in candlelit counting houses now operates through fiber optic cables carrying light at speeds those merchants could never have imagined. But the fundamental promise remains unchanged. Wealth exists as information, and whoever controls the messages controls the flow. Today, as new networks emerge from Beijing and Moscow, as digital currencies multiply across continents, as the architecture of global finance fractures into competing systems, you're witnessing the same pattern that has repeated for centuries. Each generation believes it's building something permanent. Each discovers that permanence belongs only to the incentives that shape human behavior. The messages still move faster than armies. Information still travels faster than gold. And the next chapter of this story is already being written in server rooms you'll never see, by people responding to pressures they inherited from decisions made before they were born. If this changed how you see every transaction you make, every system you trust, then you understand something most never will.